My name is John Coatsworth. I'm the provost of the university. I used to be the dean of SIPA, but they found somebody who knows what he's doing, and I got kicked upstairs. Of all the many events that take place at Columbia every year, perhaps the most exciting is the Energy Symposium that's organized by the SIPA Energy Association and the Columbia Business School Energy Club. And part of the reason for that excitement has to do with the extraordinary people from both of those organizations that take charge of the organization of this symposium. The quality of the energy students at SIPA and those interested in energy at Columbia makes this institution proud. But it's partly because of the subject matter. Nothing has changed so much in the last few years as the energy sector of the global economy. Everything I thought I knew about global energy 4 or 5 years ago is now totally untrue. And a field that is changing that fast and that is so dynamic generates new issues and new problems at such a pace that only students at SIPA and the business school organizing a symposium could possibly keep up with. So thanks to the SIPA Energy Association and the Energy Club of Columbia's Business School. My happy task this afternoon is to introduce your luncheon speaker, whose name is Edward L. Morse. Ed Morse is an amazing person. He's been a professor, a businessman, a consultant, and Lord knows how many other things. He is, according to Foreign Policy, one of the top journals in the field of foreign affairs, one of the top 100 global thinkers in the United States. In fact, he's ranked number 23, which I think he takes as a challenge. I don't know who's number 22 or 21, but I know he's taking aim now. He is the author of a 92-page Citibank report on the transformation of the global energy sector, which has been more widely cited than any other document because of its conclusions, which are quite surprising. Conclusions that will not surprise perhaps people in this room, but that were shocking given what we all thought we knew about global energy just a few years ago. He is now Managing Director and Global Head of Commodities at Citi Research in New York. He previously held similar positions at Lehman Brothers, at Lewis Capital Markets, and at Credit Suisse. He's widely cited in the media. Not a week goes by without him being quoted in a newspaper that I read. Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. He served both in the Journal and the Post. He served in the U.S. government at the State Department and was later an advisor to the United Nations Compensation Commission on Iraq, as well as to the U.S. Departments of State, Energy and Defense, and to the International Energy Agency on issues related to oil, natural gas, and the impact of financial flows on energy prices. He is a former Princeton professor whom we're trying to lure back to give multiple courses at Columbia. He's the author of numerous books and articles on energy, energy economics, and international affairs. He was the publisher of the Petroleum Intelligence Weekly for a long time and other trade periodicals, and worked at the Hess Energy Trading Company, HETCO, for a time. I don't know anybody who is more knowledgeable about the global energy sector than Ed Morse. And he has been, I should also say, a wonderful supporter and a constant advisor to the deans at SIPA and to our faculty. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome him back to Columbia. Ed.
Thank you very much for that really wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, as it always is, at events such as this at SIPA. It's not the first time I've been at an energy symposium, and I certainly hope it's not the last. One of the remarkable things about the energy environment and the energy sector is that it keeps evolving, it keeps changing. Every time you think you know something about this old industry, something comes, something changes, and you learn something new. 5 years ago, it would have been true of almost anybody speaking at an event like this, that they would have awakened in the morning and they would have assumed that there was a world in which the United States was going to be increasing its energy consumption one year to the next, in which the United States was going to be decreasing its energy primary production from one year to the next. They would assume that this was a world in which prices of oil, natural gas, and other energy sources were going to go up. And they would have assumed that this was a world in which the cost of finding and developing new material was also going to go up. And now, when I wake up in the morning, I have exactly the four opposite conclusions to those issues. I think next year, U.S. energy consumption is going to go down. I think next year, U.S. production is going to go up. I think next year, the costs of finding and developing hydrocarbons are going to go down. And I think next year, the price of commodities in this field are also going to go down. So this is a very new phenomenon, something that only emerged in the last few years, and there are still Luddite doubters that these fundamental changes have taken place. So we're living in a world, and we're at a conference at SIPA, in which what happens globally is really very significant. When we think of energy, we tend to think of this being a global environment in which energy demand is going up dramatically in emerging markets. Energy consumption in emerging markets is now outpacing energy consumption in the old OECD. Energy demand in terms of power generation is really the major problem for the economic development of economies globally. And yet, when we think about energy today, our attention is focused on the United States. It's also focused a little bit on Canada. And the reason it's focused on the U.S. and Canada is because high prices have brought about a supply revolution, and that supply revolution is unfolding most dramatically in the United States. And to give you a sense of this, when it comes to oil, our forecasts are that oil demand in hour means not just Citibank, but virtually all banks, but more importantly, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the OPEC Secretariat, and the International Energy Agency, all of the public arena places where people think about energy demand, think that oil product demand is going to rise by roughly 1 million barrels a day, plus or minus a little bit, next year versus this year, and the year after that versus next year. And if we look at what's happening in North America now, there's more than enough supply to fill that gap in demand. In the last 5 years, the U.S. has been the fastest growing energy supplier in the world. This year, given the most recent weekly data from the Energy Information Administration, real crude oil production today is up over 950,000 barrels a day above where it was a year ago. And that doesn't include natural gas liquids, it doesn't include biofuels, and it certainly doesn't include Canadian production, which is trapped in North America into serving the U.S. market. This is a really phenomenal transformation, and it's one that's going to stay with the world for a long time. It's going to stay because the resources of the world that have been unleashed in North America are abundant everywhere else. They come from the original source rock of shale that gives rise to 90% of the hydrocarbons, gas and oil available in the world, whether in North Dakota or Alaska or the Fertile Crescent. Why has this unfolded in North America? When we look at the literature on this, we tend to think about the concentration of geological knowledge, because this is very well-drilled territory. We think about the transportation infrastructure. We think about the stability of the U.S. political system, and I'll have a word to say about that, which differs from what the last panel was all about, and I disagreed with some of the conclusions in the last panel in this regard, as deeply as I can imagine disagreeing with something. But I think at the end there are three factors in North America that are truly unique to the United States and Canada that cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world. And when people think it can be replicated, they will come in for a surprise, because there is a really fundamental difference in the philosophy of owning and developing natural resources in North America. The three differences are, first, that we have entrepreneurial independent companies. Unlike Mexico, which has a national monopoly, what has driven this supply revolution has been more than 36 independent companies with entrepreneurial spirit and not a lot of money. If we, any two or three of us, found a wonderful geologist, we could probably find, and I'll come back to this in a minute, somebody to finance and a development in this business. The costs of entry are really dramatically low. And that's the second point. The companies that have really refined the techniques for developing the shale resource base of North America are cash poor. Unlike Exxon or Rosneft, they do not use their own cash flow to underwrite their capital expenditures, but rather they go to the capital markets of North America, which are also unique and which have a 70-year history of financing risk-taking in the hydrocarbon sector. Now, some might say you could find this in Australia, you could find this in the United Kingdom, you can find this in Norway, and that is true to some extent. But what is not true of any other place is the third element of this, and that is that in North America, while the state owns some mineral resources, the overwhelming majority of the resources are owned by landowners. And in most of the rest of the world, the resources are owned by the sovereign. And there's a long history as to why this might be the case. But when the sovereign owns resources, the sovereign has an interest in the rentability of those resources. So the sovereign puts a tax system in place that is designed a priori to enable the sovereign to grab whatever share of the resource rent the sovereign deems desirable. In North America, we don't have sovereigns that grab the resource rent. In North America, we have landowners who negotiate the resource rent with producers and banks. And they're very flexible in those negotiations. So as the conditions change over time, the nature of the resource rent changes over time. But the landowner does this because the landowner has a direct stake in whatever those resources are. And I would submit that that really unique quality of what's happened, of the underlying system of resource rentability in North America is what makes this resource revolution truly a North American one. That's not to say that it doesn't have global repercussions. And if I have time, although time was meant for questions as well, I'll look at a half a dozen repercussions that are far more global in nature than meets the eye. And the first of this has to do with the global footprint. The U.S. has had an enormous impact on the evolution of the global energy sector because of its enormous footprint. And that enormous footprint keeps delivering. And to give you a sense of the delivery on that, in 2007, the U.S. was an importer of 12.1 million barrels a day net of crude oil and petroleum products. The latest data for year-to-date show that the U.S. is a net importer of petroleum products of 4.3 million barrels a day less than we were a net importer 4.5 years ago. And to give you a sense of what 4.3 million barrels a day means, 4.3 million barrels a day, the footprint that we've left and no longer make, that's more than the total production of Mexico, of Venezuela, of Iraq, of Iran. Indeed, it's more than the total production of any countries in the world other than Russia, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and China. And that footprint will dwindle by at least that same amount between now and the end of the decade. As that footprint has changed, and I know there were a lot of doubts about the exports of LNG that were expressed in the last panel, but as that footprint continues to contract, the U.S. and Canada together are changing from being net importers to being net exporters of hydrocarbons. And this is an inevitability. We've already, within the law, gone from being the world's largest importer of petroleum products to being the largest exporter of petroleum products, a big change that's also unfolded over the past 4.5 years. There's a lot of discussion because we have this superabundance of natural gas resources of whether following the Sabin Pass LNG facility, there will be other export facilities in the U.S. And I can tell you as a student of the export laws of the United States, it is really difficult to bar exports of LNG, whether to free trade agreement partners or non-free trade agreement partners. And although there's talk about a government review, that government review is in the context of powerful interests that do not want to see LNG exports, powerful interests that includes significant parts of the petrochemical industry, that includes environmentalists, either concentrated on the West Coast or with a national footprint, who don't like the trade-off involved between the development of what are inherently dirty, sometimes called poisonous things, versus the benefits from their economic development. And there are other opponents also in Congress who want to keep the natural gas at home because the city gate prices in their neighborhoods are extremely high as compared to the price at the Henry Hub, where natural gas is essentially priced. But these opposition groups can only express their opposition through legislation that bans these exports. It is really difficult to consider circumstances other than a congressional ban that would deprive those who are filing for export facilities from getting them. And it will be the marketplace, inevitably, that will have their impact. Similarly, when it comes to oil exports, some oil exports are banned, some oil exports are not banned. It is really hard to ban exports of crude oil to free trade agreement countries. It's hard to imagine that the court system would support the banning of exports to free trade agreement countries that are signatories of treaties that enable this. And that's why the U.S. now exports some 60,000 barrels a day to Canada, and why the growing glut of crude oil in the United States will result in our forecast for the U.S. to be exporting more than 200,000 barrels a day to Canada by the end of 2013, and then increasing more to the eastern side of Canada by the end of 2014, at which point, when the Panama Canal expansion is completed, it will make sense to export to Korea as well, because Korea not only is a free trade agreement country, but Korea as a free trade agreement country gives a benefit to imports from free trade agreement partners. That benefit is mostly in the form of a tax relief, a tariff relief. Korea has become a very large buyer of North Sea crude. Korea has a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. It has a free trade agreement with the European Union, and from that free trade agreement, there is no 3% tariff, and that means on a 2 million barrel vessel transporting oil from Aberdeen, Scotland to a Korean port, there is no 7% tax penalty that is imposed on imports from other countries, and they'll have that same benefit when the transportation system enables passage through the Panama Canal. A second of the half a dozen points I wanted to make but won't make has to do with the nature of what's happened on the supply side in natural gas. We've essentially had a supply revolution with a very limited demand response. We have what you might call a 10 BCF a day bubble. This is in a 65 BCF a day market. And there have been ripple effects that have been global as a result of that. The major ripple effect is that this gas bubble has brought prices down dramatically. Last spring, we saw the price of natural gas fall at times below $2 per million BTU. That's roughly half of what it is trading for today, a little bit on one or the other side of half. And as a result of that, that 9 BCF a day of bubble pushed out 100 million tons of coal. And it pushed it out to countries that were tied to gas prices that were linked to either crude oil or oil products. And the result of that is, while we have dramatically reduced in the U.S. without any policy pushing us in this direction, our carbon footprint, we have exported our carbon footprint to the United Kingdom and to Germany, countries in the middle of Europe where nuclear energy is no longer considered desirable, and where their carbon footprint is increasing dramatically as a result of cheap coal that is not priced by any carbon setting. Our coal is also moving to areas in emerging markets, increasing their carbon footprint as well. So there are ripple effects that exist. We can also, and here's my third point, the world changes by snowballs. The world changes because of the cumulative impact of investments, the cumulative impact of change. At the moment, natural gas and oil is separated because one is a power generating fuel and the other is a transportation fuel. But it looks as though we will be seeing dramatic growth of natural gas as a transportation fuel in the United States. We'll also see it in China. We'll probably see it in other parts of the emerging world and in OECD Europe as well. And it may well be that by the time this decade ends, there will be enough natural gas in the transportation sector to bring oil and gas prices back into a competitive equilibrium with one another. And just to give you one example of how this might change, it is currently the case that we in the United States consume 2 million barrels a day of diesel for heavy-duty trucks. It could well be that the economics of using LNG in trucks and in trains and rail transport and heavy-duty truck transport are such that virtually all of that 2 million barrels a day of diesel demand can be replaced by natural gas in the form of LNG within a decade, maybe even less. And when it comes to CNG, the fact that some companies have recently announced appliances that can be brought into the garage of a house that cost $500 to create compressed natural gas for vehicles could well solve the distribution problem ahead. I wanted to talk about some trading aspects of what has happened in North America. I want to talk about global benchmarks as a result of what's happened in North America. I will talk only about the sixth item that I wanted to talk about, and that's policy. The panelists in the last session, to a person, I would say to a man, because nobody could find people of the other gender to be on the panel for whatever reason, but the men on the last panel, all to a person bemoaned the fact that energy policy is so incoherent in the United States. Energy policy is also incoherent in Canada. In fact, I would say the major driver of this supply response in the dynamic duo of Canada and the United States is the fact that the constitutions of these countries have made energy policy dysfunctional. And I think if we compare them with a country that the provost knows very well, namely Mexico to the south of the United States, where there is a really coherent energy policy that's been in place for the better part of a century. That coherence is what has deprived that country of doing what has happened in North America, and it's the dysfunctionality of the North American arena that has enabled it to work. And although, as many of you know, both political parties in the United States cribbed from the city report that the provost had mentioned, one of them in particular lifted whole paragraphs in his national energy policy. One of the things in Governor Romney's otherwise coherent energy policy statement was to give the states the power to do things that are now in the hands of the federal government. And I would suggest that it's really the ability of the states to be independent of the federal government now that has created conditions which are sloppy to some degree because they deprive the country of what might be a coherent environmental policy for resource development, but they do enable the country to have conditions that enable this remarkable supply revolution for unfolding. Now, I had promised to give more than 4 or 5 minutes to discussion. I'm not going to have a chance to do more than 4 or 5 minutes, but I certainly would welcome any questions that any of you have. I haven't really talked about energy independence and what it might mean, and I can certainly fill the gap for 5 minutes if anyone does want to ask a question, but thanks very much. Peter, yeah, I guess.
Hi, Ed. I have a real quick question. It seems in policy circles there's been an oversight on looking at gas to liquids with this huge resource base of natural gas.
Is that a question, or?
That's a question.
Yeah, I think in policy circles it has been. I wonder whether policy circles could do much about it. I think there are areas where the policy circles can do a lot, but you know, it is the uncertainty of whether the current divergence between natural gas prices and diesel prices that make this an attractive possibility. Both in Canada and the U.S., the Canadian projects that were committed to in the last 2 years seem to have faded in the background. I think they've faded in the background not because of the economics, but rather because of the situation of the companies that were involved in those projects. There's so much stranded gas in Alberta and in British Columbia that I think the marketplace would make it an appealing kind of project. Sasol has certainly not given up on its announced projects in Louisiana, and I think the only real market risk for those projects would come from the displacement of diesel demand in the heavy-duty truck fleet because of the natural gas replacement of it, not indirectly through the GTL process, but rather directly by gas becoming a transportation fuel. But I agree with the intent of your statement, Pete.
Mr. Morse, we'll have just time for one short question.
Okay, this should be short and to the point. You had brought up energy independence. I was just wondering where the funding is for things like tidal or geothermal or small microhydro or distributed solar, as opposed to these large power plants that seem to be sprouting up all over the place.
Yeah, I think the regulatory system is what's responsible for that, and I'm not one of the people who thinks that renewables have lost their financial life just because of the loss of subsidies. But I think if we could find a way to institute regulatory reform at the state level and the intrastate level, it would go a long way. It's a major challenge for legislation, particularly given the importance of the interest groups in local markets and their unwillingness to provide enough of an incentive for other sources of power generation in particular from entering the marketplace. So I think there's plenty of scope for innovation. Anyway, I'm sorry there's, maybe you're not sorry, I'm sorry there's not much more time for questions and discussions, but it really has been a pleasure for me to be with you again. Thanks a lot.